All right, guys, so we're going to begin our unit SLL 6 on the global empires by focusing on our East Asian empires. And today we're going to talk about China and Japan. So we're going to be picking up where you kind of left off in World History 1 with where was China at this point. So remember that Confucius is a really big, important part of Chinese culture, and that Confucian thought really influences them. Now, his teachings aren't accepted until about 400 years after his death, but they do become a big part of the culture. One of the things that Confucius really focused on was ethics and respect for your elders. You remember that concept of filial piety, which is that children should respect their elders. He also talked about relationships, that there was a relationship between a teacher and a student, a father and a son. And very much that's how he saw the rulers. The rulers should be like this kind of father figure, and he would do what's best for the country, and the people would follow that. And just keep in mind that Confucius is very influential in Chinese culture, and we're going to see how Buddhism will come in and will complement Confucianism. They do not go against each other. So the Mongol Dynasty is really who comes in first and kind of changes everything up. If you remember, like the Great Wall of China was built to keep out invaders, and the Mongols, who had kind of been going everywhere, because the Mongols are awesome. And if you go into our playlist, you're going to find the Crash Course We Are the Mongols video, which is a great video to watch and talks about the Mongols and kind of the importance and achievements of those. So Genghis Khan had conquered the northern part of China, but for us, the important guy is going to be Kublai Khan, and he is going to be the most successful of Genghis Khan's grandsons. They kind of all went everywhere. Hugla is in the Middle East, Batu is in Russia, but Kublai Khan is the one we're going to focus on, and he becomes the Mongol Emperor of China. And then he's actually going to kind of expand and just take over a lot of places. And one of the things that makes Kublai Khan really unique is that he's really going to adapt to Chinese ways. So all the other Mongols adopted Islam, but Kublai Khan actually adopts Chinese ways. He also spreads China by taking Korea and then Indochina, which would be Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. He was not successful in taking Japan. Actually, he tried to go that way, but there were typhoons which destroyed his navy. But he did a lot of great things, as we're going to see with Mongols kind of all over. Mongols do the same thing in Russia. They do the same thing in India, as they really do a lot of advancements, things like building roads, making sure that people were taken care of. The Mongols are really good at building roads and connecting people. And he very much encouraged trade, and he invited foreign merchants to come to China and realized that China had a lot to share. Let's think about those things that China was able to trade. We remember our list. So if you think about it for a moment, maybe you want to pause and think. You should come up with tea, porcelain, gunpowder, silk, paper. Even the compass was something that they traded. Really, the Chinese are so smart. They invented ice cream and kites and just all kinds of things that the Chinese invented. One of his favorite travelers was Marco Polo, which you probably played the game in a swimming pool before. But Marco Polo was actually the son of an Italian merchant, and he traveled to China. He's really interesting because Marco Polo is called the Prince of Liars because he went to China and then he wrote down all these stories about what he'd seen, and people thought that these stories were so outlandish they didn't even believe him. For example, he talked about this rock that would continue to burn and heat but wouldn't actually dissolve. And he was talking about coal, which we know that what coal is now, but he just people never heard of that before. And what's really cool about Marco Polo is that he inspires people to go see, wow, look at all these cool things he wrote about in his book. Let me go see them. So there's a fun little video that you can watch by the History Channel. It's a guy singing, but it's really cool about Marco Polo. And so you can see he left from Italy, and he traveled, from Venice, and he goes, and, he's looking at all this cool stuff that he gets to see. And really, this is kind of a big chunk of the known world at this time period. Remember, this is before Christopher Columbus is gone. So, this is 1200s. Christopher Columbus doesn't sail the ocean blue until 1492. So this is the video I was talking about. So trade is safe under the Mongols. Same thing in Russia. It's really safe at this time period. A lot of things are being passed to Europe, and they're kind of seeing how advanced that the Chinese are. So However, if you remember that mandate of heaven and that whole dynastic cycle, there's this continual where you'll see we get an emperor, he'll rule, he's really good, things are going well, then something bad happens, and then people overthrow him. And then we start a new mandate of heaven. So this happens. I always think this is so cool. Like, a Buddhist monk gets so upset. Buddhists who are supposed to be all nonviolent, he actually goes to war and leads this rebellion. And he's going to start the Ming Dynasty, which means brilliant or illustrious. And this is going to be this kind of epic time period of just really good things for China. He sets up this great efficient government. They have a good time of peace and prosperity. Also during this time period, Zhang Ho is this great explorer. That's a picture of him there. We believe that the Chinese actually had the capacity to have crossed the Pacific and go to the New World. However, they didn't. They built these amazingly large ships and they did all these really cool things. They traveled to Africa and India, and he brought all these kind of neat things there, things that Chinese had never seen before, like giraffes and lions, zebras, and they literally were 100 years ahead of anybody else. But they begin to get afraid and concerned about all this foreign influence, and we're going to see an end to this Chinese exploration. One of the things I want you to consider as we're talking about these Asian empires, the Chinese are super advanced. The Ottomans were super advanced. What happens that they stop advancing and Europe surpasses them? So this is, you can see it's Chinese, obviously, but a lot of the path that he went. And you can watch his crash course video if you want, or we'll watch it later, but kind of comparing Zhang Ho to a Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, and also to Christopher Columbus, who actually was better. So they stop everything. The Chinese want to kind of ban foreigners. They want to isolate themselves because they're just really scared of people coming in and changing their culture. Also, it had become very expensive to maintain these really large ships that Zhang Ho had, and so they decide that we maybe want to stop this and try to do something else again. The Chinese are very arrogant in the sense that they have everything they need. I love this quote. There's nothing we lack. We, the Chinese, we lack. This is a letter he wrote to King George of Britain. Like, we don't need your stuff, but if you want to trade with us, that's fine. We've got all the amazing stuff. And everybody did want what China had. They wanted the tea, the silk, the porcelain that they had. And this is really even China's view of the world. It's very distorted. You can kind of see like maybe this is Korea, but they viewed themselves as the center of the world. There's this term called the Middle Kingdom. That's how they referred to themselves. And not as like they're the middle, like there's a high and the low, but as in middle, like we're the center of the universe. And so you see here, we're talking about the Ming Dynasty, and then look at the Qing Dynasty is going to come after. It's all this purple here, and you can see how much further they're going to expand. And then we'll be focusing on Japan in just a little bit. So the Qing Dynasty is a very long time period, 400 years. They expand the borders, and the population grows. Because it's peaceful, there's increased agriculture, so people are living longer, their children are not dying, they're living to adulthood, and so we're just going to see a lot of prosperity. So the Mings kind of start this prosperity, but then think about that cycle. The Mings come in, things are going well, then they stop the exploration, the lack of trade hurts them, and then we get a new dynasty in. So we begin to see this continual, they decide we do want to trade with the Europeans and we're going to limit it. So the Portuguese come in 1514 and they set up a trading post. So Macau is actually this tiny like little area, kind of little part that peninsula sticks off of the end of China there. And they come in and they want control of these ports, and the Chinese say, okay, we're going to trade with you, but we're going to set up, and this is a really important word, we're going to set up enclaves. Now, you might actually want to highlight that in your notes. An enclave, just think about the word enclose. And so they say, okay, Portugal, you can have this port, but just this port. And that's because they didn't want the foreigner influence to go beyond that. Foreigners also had to pay tribute, they have to pay money, and they have to perform kowtow, which you can see this guy in this photo, he's bowing down. The Dutch have the most success, and that's because the Dutch are not trying to change Chinese culture. The others are coming in and wanting to convert people to Christianity. They don't have the respect for the Chinese emperors. And this all makes them mad because they don't want somebody coming in and changing their culture. Okay, so that's kind of where we leave China. They got these success, they're getting a little scared of foreigners, and they've set up enclaves because they want to limit the foreign influence. So let's turn to Japan. What geographic word would describe Japan if we're looking at Japan? So Japan is a group of islands. There are 4 large islands and several smaller ones. And so it's an archipelago. So remember that an archipelago is a group or chain of islands like Hawaii, like the Bahamas, like the Florida Keys, like Indonesia, the Philippines. So because it's an archipelago, the majority of land is actually very steep mountains. So only about 20% of the land is actually arable, livable, farmable land. Most people live near the coast, and because only 20% of their land is actually arable, they get most of their food from the sea. Japan, because they were an archipelago, was also very isolated to other cultures. And eventually, though, they're going to get in contact with China via Korea, and they're going to end up doing a several hundred years kind of cultural exchange. Buddhism, as we know, Ashoka sends Buddhism from India to China. Then it's going to share with Koreans, and then it's going to get to Japan. And Japan's going to become interested in this and want to trade and talk more with China. Remember that Shintoism is the dominant religion in Japan, and most people are Shinto, which is a type of animism. And basically, it's the idea that natural objects have souls. So, like an amazing waterfall could have a soul, and that's that idea of kami, this spirit that lives in them. And even the emperor had that. And your goal is to live in harmony with nature. So if you think about it, this is a lot like Taoism in Chinese culture, which emphasize also harmony with nature. So they get this exchange and they take Buddhism and they're like, hey, we really like Buddhism. So they actually combine all of this and they develop a unique form of Buddhism called Zen Buddhism. And Zen Buddhism has a lot of emphasis on nature. Prince Shotoka was actually one of the ones who really was interested in spreading this idea of Buddhism in China. So Buddhism, spreading it in Japan, Buddhism comes from China and it becomes very popular. And the samurai, who we know are in Japan, actually began to practice Zen Buddhism as a way to help them increase their discipline, which is Bushido. And Bushido would be comparable to the, if you think about the Middle Ages, comparable to the knights' idea of kind of chivalry. It's a code of honor for them. So military society is really going to grow in Japan. They actually have an emperor, but it's really a feudal system. So just like in the Middle Ages where the king didn't have a lot of power, the king's power really rested in the hands of the lords who were kind of running everything. And so it's the same thing. We're going to have these samurai who are serving, they're like the knights, and they're serving the Diamyo, which are your nobles. And the shogun is the head guy, and he is ruling in the emperor's name. He's a military leader, the shogun. He's the Mac Daddy samurai, and he's ruling in their name. So you can kind of see how you have the different kind of nobles here in each of these, the Diamyos in each area. And then one over all of them would have been the shogun. So you have this kind of feudal society in feudal Japan, very much like the Middle Ages. You got the emperor at the top, but remember the real power is in the shogun, who is the military leader, then the daimyo, then the samurais, and then the peasants. So you can see this here. Now, Japan is very interesting. This is also in Chinese culture. They're the only cultures where the artisans and merchants actually go below the peasants. And the reason is because in Confucian culture, dealing with money was considered to be a very low kind of ranking in society. It was better to farm the land than it was to deal with money. So it's an interesting thing that artisans and merchants kind of fall down here on the bottom. So you can kind of fill in your chart from this. Notice that daimyos and samurai are kind of here on the same level. So these samurais are influenced by Confucianism and Buddhism. Bushido, remember, is their code of honor. And part of this code of honor, like if you lose in battle, you are expected to commit suicide. You fall on your own sword because they feel so strongly about this. There's a cool little video if you want to follow this link. It's also on our learning module page, and just a quick little cartoon. It's like 2 minutes long by the History Channel that really just kind of goes over Bushido and the importance of that. So you can see here, I did a little contrast. I think this is really cool, like feudal Europe versus feudal Japan. They both have feudal societies with the king or emperor, and then you've got the warriors, the knights and the samurai. They have the code of honor, the peasants. So, but remember, in Europe, they're going to be Christian, but in Japan, they're practicing Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism. Their art is going to be very related to nature versus, remember, in the Middle Ages, it's going to be very religious. So kind of interesting to look at that kind of comparison between those. Now, the Tokugawa become the strongest of the shogunates, and they really are ruling over everything. And just like China, they become very concerned about foreign influence. This is actually some of the laws, a primary source from 1634. Japanese ships shall not be sent abroad. No Japanese shall be sent abroad. Anyone breaking this law shall suffer the penalty of death. Anyone who has lived abroad shall be put to death when they come to home. They are very serious about not having any outside influence. So when the Portuguese show up, at first they welcome them, but again, there's this fear of the outsiders because the outsiders come in and they want to change Japanese culture. And the Japanese do not like that, just like the Chinese did not. Jesuit missionaries come in, and this is where the real problem comes in because the Jesuit missionaries start destroying the Japanese shrines and the temples. And so they're like, nope, we're done. And so they kick out the Jesuit missionaries, and they only allow one Dutch group to remain and trade. Remember that the Dutch were the most successful because they didn't try to force their culture on the groups that they conquered or try to trade with. So just like China, Japan is going to become isolated, and the rest of the world is going to make progress. So that question I asked you at the beginning, why are China and Japan and the Ottomans, what happens that Europe goes ahead and they stop? This is really the key. It's the fact that they stop trading with the outside world. They kind of cut themselves off. The Ottomans will do the same thing. Now, the samurais are going to rule to the 1800s, and then things are going to change when the Americans show up. I also have a cool little thing on Kabuki theater that you can watch as well. So, in summary, as we're thinking about all these guys, remember that China, Japan are isolating themselves because they are scared of the influence of foreigners. China actually sets up these little enclaves, which are these little special areas that are enclosed for trade with foreigners. And Japan is like, nope, nobody at all. All right, so that kind of cuts everything that we need to know for China and Japan.